Mr Speaker, I'd just like to make a remark about the speech by Sir Roger Douglas, which unfortunately hasn't remained in the House, but it's a bit hard to take him seriously, given that he presided over one of the biggest growths in unemployment in New Zealand's history.
Point of order. There's a point of order by the...
You're not supposed to say whether a member is in or outside of the House.
Thank you for that, yes. The member can't refer to the absence of a member in the House. Claire Curran.
Apologies, Mr Speaker. I want to talk a bit about what this government actually is, and my colleague Darren Hughes today quite accurately described it as a mirage, because ultimately it doesn't mean what it says. What this government does is a thing called Orwellian language. Orwellian language, which means the definition, an attitude and a policy of control by propaganda, surveillance, misinformation, denial of truth and manipulation of the past. And the Minister, Kate Wilkinson, stood in the House today at question time and again during her first reading speech and described this bill as fair and reasonable. Well, let me tell you what fair and reasonable means. According to this government, it means unfair and unreasonable. Every time this government says certain words, you know it means something else, the opposite. She says the bill is not major, that it's only a little change. Well, it means a big change. Just like Tony Ryle, who talks constantly about change in health. Change, which equals cuts. Or Bill English, who talks about change in the public sector and reprioritisation. Words that mean cuts. Cuts to people's services and cuts to people's jobs. And the icing on the cake is aspirational, which means we don't really mean it. We are aspirational about closing the wage gap between New Zealand and Australia. We are aspirational about creating 170,000 jobs, was it? Something like that. Unfortunately, they're not aspirational about this bill. They really mean it, but it's not a small change that is fair and reasonable. It's a major shift towards fundamentally affecting the relationship between employers and employees in our New Zealand workplaces, and it's taking us backwards as a country. It'll affect the morale and the productivity of employees, hard-working New Zealanders, people who earn wages and salaries, people who aren't liars and slackers. It'll make workplaces harder to be in, and it'll entrench unfairness in our employment relations system. It won't do anything to address the fact that we don't have enough jobs in this country. We don't have an economic plan. And if the Australian Labor Party win the election on Saturday, it'll make Australia an even more attractive place to head for. Higher wages, more jobs, and an environment that encourages and enables working people and doesn't make them feel bad. Mr Speaker, Labor opposes this bill, and I want to commend all my colleagues for their efforts to expose this bill for what it really is, an assault on workers' rights, wages and conditions, and it demonstrates the government as implicitly saying at the outset, quote, "We don't care about fairness or treating employees as a valuable resource." It's a continuation of National's attack on workers' rights, wages and conditions, and these amendments are unfair, unbalanced and unnecessary. And as I said, it's a backward step for New Zealand, and it'll undermine the ability of New Zealand employees to improve their wages and working conditions. So I just want to talk briefly about a couple of the measures. The 90-day trial period, which will let employers sack employees for no justifiable reason within 90 days of taking a new job. With an estimated 700,000 people that change jobs every year and about 300,000 at any one time in their first 90 days, it will have a grave effect on most workers. Sloppy, and I know one of my other colleagues called it sloppy and bad management practices. It'll allow and encourage employers to substitute dismissal for sound appointment and induction and good supervision and training for new employees. And it will lead to considerable abuse and bad practice. It won't increase employment. or work towards closing that gap with Australia. During the 1990s, the Employment Contracts Act allowed many of these practices, so it is going backwards, it's back to the future, and that was the result. The result of that bad practice and destruction of unions was low wages. And in the 1990s, after inflation, the average wage rose only 6% over the 10 years that the legislation was in force, and studies of this period show exports were built on low wages and low skills rather than high value, and it was when most of the growth gap with Australia opened up. So is that what we're heading for again? Just a few examples of real people. A woman who have been affected by the existing 90 days law, the woman in Auckland who worked at a bar and got the sack because she thought her employer wanted to hire younger people. There was nothing wrong with the quality of her work, just her age. But as I was told, how do you prove it? She couldn't. She had to leave. Not fair. The man in Wellington who gave up a good job to go and work in a PR company. He got to the new job and discovered that the builders were doing renovations and he didn't have an office. He didn't have a job. The young worker at Burger Fuel who was dismissed for asking for a tea break. Dismissed for asking for a tea break. No ability to defend themselves. Not fair. 22% of people employed on the 90-day trial basis to date have lost their jobs. And if there was a problem with the quality of the work being done or the behaviour in the workplace, they can be dismissed fairly. Why make it legal to dismiss unfairly? It goes against the grain, it goes against the New Zealand psyche, it goes against the essence of what it means to be a New Zealander. And it legislates for bad employers and bad employment practices. Bad law. I didn't come into this place to see bad law being enacted.
Well, that got me going.
I also want to speak about restricting union access, which is an ideological and deliberate attack on the democratic right of workers to join unions and resolve workplace issues. There are campaigns nationwide on the streets, workers and unions protesting this unjust and unfair legislation. And you've heard it from the Labour members and the Greens about this today. It's about fairness. This government has at least now shown its true colours. It pretended to like the unions and the CTU for the first 19 months of this government, and all of a sudden this legislation has shown what they really think. Keep them out of workplaces. And I heard Kate Wilkinson say at question time today that it was just a small change that provided discretion to employers to be able to plan. Plan for what? Plan to be able to block union representatives from workplaces if there's any whiff of trouble. In other words, prevent employees from exercising their rights to be represented in their workplaces. And at the same time, we know that there's actually no need for the change. The regulatory impact statement noted that there does not appear to be widespread evidence of union representatives exercising their current rights to enter workplaces in an inappropriate way, resulting in disruption for business operations or adversely impacting on the employment relationship between employer and union members. And having lived in Australia for a few years during the 1990s, I saw what happened when the Howard government unfairly took on the unions and workers and interfered with that relationship between working people and their employers and tried to skew it to the side of employers. Many thousands, hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets over it, and he had to back down because it was fundamentally unfair. It's a short-sighted attack on workers, and it will have negative consequences, not only for working people but for the initiatives to change our workforce in our workplaces into the productive, and it just appalls me to hear you say exactly the opposite, into the productive, well-rewarded places that they need to be for real growth in the economy. I just want to mention a few things about National's past record on workers' rights. Too many of the ministers in the current government are from National's school of the 90s, which taught that workers' rights should be secondary to business profits. National's got a shocking record on workers' rights, but it tried to put it on a smiley face at